Dad, we've sold the book collection, or we're about to. Pemberton's auction house is handling the paperwork. You can't read anymore, so what's the point of keeping it? Besides, the dust from all those old books has been giving Claudia allergies all year. Those were the first words my son, Richard, said to me after I walked through the door of my own home on Friday afternoon, February 7th. Not, "Hi, Dad, you're back." Not, "Are you feeling all right after 17 days in the hospital?" Not anything you'd say to someone who had just survived a stroke. I stood in the doorway of the reading room, the room I had built over 45 years from the first small bookcase in the corner of my student bedroom in the lean years at Harvard, to four walls completely covered by custom-built oak shelving, each shelf holding books I had searched for, ordered, traded for, and treasured across a lifetime. The reading room now looked like someone had just pulled half the teeth from a jaw. Large gaps on the shelves, dark empty patches where thousands of books had once stood shoulder to shoulder. My name is Thomas Edward Whitfield. I am 75 years old. I was a professor of history at Boston University for 38 years until I retired in 2014. And my book collection, nearly 4,000 volumes, more than 300 of them classified as rare or notable, was the work of a lifetime. Not as an investment, not for display, but to read, to think, to remember that human beings had lived and thought and written the most beautiful and important things since the invention of writing. And now those things were being sent to Pemberton's to be traded for money to buy a boat. I knew about the boat. Richard had been talking about it for months. A 42-foot Sea Ray, white, moored at a marina in Gloucester, Massachusetts, waiting for someone to put down the final deposit. He called it an investment in quality of life. Claudia, his wife, the woman I had first met in 2019 when he brought her home to introduce us, the woman whose manner of speaking to me had always carried the tone of someone explaining something to a slow child, called it what we deserve. Claudia came out of the kitchen. "Oh, you're back, Dad. You look better than I expected." There was something in her voice, not exactly disappointment, and more like a recalibration of expectations. The look of someone who had ordered something online and discovered it still functioned when they had been hoping it wouldn't. "You need to rest. Your room is ready. I had it cleaned and put up new curtains." "My reading room," I said, my voice sounding strange to me. Rougher, slower, one of the effects of the stroke that the doctor said would gradually improve but hadn't said how long it would take. "This is my house. Those books are mine." "Dad," Richard said, his voice carrying the patience of someone who had practiced that voice, "we're not saying you don't have rights. We just think that under the circumstances, you need to focus on recovering, not worrying about books. And to be honest, that collection has real value. Pemberton's estimated around 200,000, possibly more with a good auction. That money will pay the deposit on the boat," I said. A brief silence. Richard and Claudia exchanged the look of a couple who have already discussed and decided something and don't want anyone to change the plan. "You can just watch television," Claudia said. "That pile of old paper only causes allergies. I had to spray the whole room last week." Old paper. The Federalist Papers printed in 1788 that I had acquired from a Philadelphia collector after 12 years of searching. The 3-volume first British edition of David Hume's philosophy, with the signature of its first owner, a Boston merchant in 1791. The first printing of Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk in 1903, missing its cover but otherwise intact. And hundreds of other volumes, each one carrying its own story about the person who had written it, the person who had printed it, the people who had read it before me. "Old paper," I repeated. Not in anger, only to hear myself say it out loud and confirm I had heard correctly. I turned back into the reading room and sat down in the brown leather armchair, the only piece in the room they hadn't touched, probably because it was too heavy to move easily. I looked at the shelves that remained. Books Pemberton's hadn't taken yet. Books perhaps not valuable enough to auction. Books stacked haphazardly in cardboard boxes in the corner waiting to be sorted. And I began to think, not in a state of panic, not in anger. Anger would come later when I had the strength for it. But in the way of a man who had spent 38 years teaching history and understood that in any difficult situation, the first thing to do is gather information and assess what you actually have. That night, after Richard and Claudia had gone to bed and the lights in the house were out, I used the cane the doctor had lent me and stood up from the leather chair. My left leg was still weak, a lasting effect of the stroke. The doctor said it would improve with physical therapy, but for now, every step required focus. I moved slowly, placing each foot carefully on the old hardwood floor of the house on Commonwealth Avenue. The house that Eleanor and I had bought in 1981, the house where our 3 children had grown up. Eleanor. I thought of her then in the way you think of someone you have lost when you are at your most alone. Not with diffuse sadness, but with a specific question. If Eleanor were still alive, would this be happening? My answer was no. And Eleanor died in 2015. And after that, this house had slowly become a different kind of house. Richard and Claudia had moved in to live with me, initially on the grounds of keeping Dad company, and then gradually everything in the house had come to follow their logic more than mine. I reached the cardboard boxes in the corner of the reading room. The streetlight through the window gave enough light to see dimly. I didn't turn on the lamp because I didn't want to wake Richard and Claudia. I bent down, slowly, carefully, my back still stiff from days in the hospital, and began taking books out of the boxes one by one. The books in the boxes were ones Pemberton's hadn't chosen, or hadn't yet. Mostly contemporary academic works, textbooks, volumes whose market value wasn't high. But I wasn't searching for market value just then. I was taking inventory, seeing what was left, what had been taken. And in the third box, I found the Federalist Papers. I picked it up and sat down on the floor. Not because I chose to sit on the floor, but because my legs couldn't hold a standing position for long just then. I sat on the old hardwood of the reading room, in the dark of the house I had lived in for 40 years, holding the old book wrapped in its protective plastic sleeve the way I had always stored it, and realized this was not the Federalist Papers set I had assumed it was. This was a single volume, not part of a set. And inside the front cover, tucked between pages 6 and 7, was a small pale yellow envelope, yellowed with age. I took out the envelope. My right hand, the weaker one since the stroke, trembled slightly. Not from emotion, but from the nerves. I used my left hand, the stronger one, to open the envelope. Inside was a piece of paper folded in half, heavy, firm paper of the old financial document kind, and a smaller slip in someone's pencil handwriting. I turned toward the streetlight through the window. Read the first line on the heavy paper. Certificate of stock, Standard Oil Company of New Jersey, 100 shares. I sat on the floor of the reading room in the dark and looked at the paper in my hand. The small pencil slip was in handwriting I recognized immediately despite nearly 50 years. My father's hand. Harold Whitfield, who died in 1978 when I was 29 years old and absorbed in my Harvard dissertation. Tom, if you found this, then I never had the chance to tell you while I was alive. This is the Standard Oil stock I received from your grandfather in 1954. I never sold it because grandfather said to hold on to it. I tucked it here because I knew you read this book. The stock may not be worth much anymore, or it may be something. I'm not certain. But it belongs to you, no one else. Dad. I read that slip 3 times, the first with my eyes, the second with my lips, reading it silently, slowly, word by word, and the third with all my memory of my father. The man from Virginia, who worked as an accountant for a Boston insurance company, who never had much money but always had enough books that I grew up surrounded by readers and thinkers. 1954. My father received Standard Oil stock from my grandfather and tucked it into a book and never got around to telling me before he died in 1978. I had taken the book home after he died, along with several others from his small bookcase. And across all those years I had read it, referenced it, moved it from apartment to apartment, but never seen the small yellow envelope tucked between pages 6 and 7. I looked at the stock certificate. Standard Oil Company of New Jersey, 1954. I was a history professor. I knew Standard Oil. And I knew that Standard Oil of New Jersey had eventually become Exxon, one of the largest oil companies in the world. I knew that stock from 1954 across 70 years of dividends and stock splits could have multiplied many times over. I didn't know exactly how much, but I knew I needed to find out. And I knew that before finding out, I needed to make certain the book and what was in it didn't leave my hands. I stood up, slowly with effort, but I stood, and walked to my bedroom, put the book and envelope under my pillow, lay down, and for the first time since the stroke, I slept a full night without dreaming of the hospital. To understand why that book collection was not old paper, you need to know where I learned my love of books and what it meant to me. I was born in 1949 in Roxbury, Boston, the neighborhood that at the time was home to working-class African-American families and Italian immigrant families living side by side in old red brick buildings. My father, Harold Whitfield, was a second-generation black Bostonian, the son of a shoemaker from Virginia who had come north after World War I. My father had quit school at the 11th grade to go to work, but he had educated himself his whole life, teaching himself by reading everything he could get his hands on. My father used to take me to the Boston Public Library every Saturday, the massive building on Copley Square with its arched ceilings and marble staircases that to me, I'm at 7 or 8 years old, looked like a palace. He would sit at a reading table for 2 hours while I wandered among the children's book stacks, pulling out volumes one by one, sitting on the wood floor reading until the librarian reminded me to stand up. "Tom," my father used to say on the way home when we were riding the Chestnut Hill streetcar, "we don't have much money in this family, but books don't cost anything to learn from. The library is free, and when you've read enough, no one can take away what you've learned." He said that to me many times in many different ways. I don't know whether he understood what he was giving me or whether he was simply passing on what his father had passed on to him. What our family had learned from generations before when reading itself was something people had to fight for the right to do. And I entered Harvard in 1967 on a scholarship. A scholarship my father called the reward of 10 years reading at the public library. Not a large scholarship, enough to cover tuition, and the rest I earned working at the Harvard Library. I worked in that library and lived among books for 3 years, cataloging, shelving, packaging, and preserving old volumes. That was where I began to understand that an old book is not merely paper and ink. It is an object carrying history, bearing the fingerprints of everyone who had read it before you, holding the marginal notes of people who had thought their thoughts hundreds of years before you. The first old book I bought was in 1972, when I was a graduate student and nearly broke. A History of the American Revolution printed in 1842, I found at a secondhand shop on Charles Street for $4. I ate instant noodles for a week to save up the money. Eleanor, then my girlfriend, later my wife, looked at the book and looked at me and said, "I understand. You're the kind of person who buys books before buying food." "Both are necessary to live," I said. She laughed. "I just needed to know that before marrying you." We married in 1975. Eleanor was also a teacher. She taught literature at Roxbury High School. In 40 years of marriage, she never once complained about the money I spent on books, though there were months when I bought more books than clothes. She only set one condition. You have to read every book you buy. No buying books for display. I kept that promise. Every book in the reading room on Commonwealth Avenue had passed through my hands. Awe had left its mark on me. Sometimes a small pencil note in the margin, sometimes only the memory of the first time I read it. I became a history professor at Boston University in 1976, when I was 27 years old. Not because I had no other options. I had received offers from 2 other institutions and a research position at the Smithsonian. I chose Boston University because I wanted to teach, not merely to research, and because Boston was home. 38 years of teaching, 12 books of my own, thousands of students passing through my courses, and alongside all of that, the collection growing year by year. I was not a collector in the commercial sense. I never bought books to resell or as investments. I bought them because I wanted to read them, because I wanted to study them, because every good old book carries a thread of connection to history that no modern reprint can fully reproduce. When I hold a history printed in 1800 and read it, I am reading alongside everyone who read it before me. People who read history with the understanding of their time, with the assumptions and prejudices of their time, and sometimes the way they interpreted an event tells me more about the century they inhabited than about the event they were describing. Richard grew up in a house full of those books. He did well in school, intelligent, quick, good at persuading people. But I never saw him sit down and read a book because he wanted to, not because he was required to. That wasn't a fault in him. People love different things, and no one is obligated to love books. But it meant he didn't understand why the books in my reading room mattered to me in the way they did. Claudia, his wife, the woman with the MBA and the practicality I respected in its own way, looked into my reading room and saw underutilized space, potential dust, and market value that hadn't been converted into money. Two people looking at the same thing and seeing two entirely different things. That wasn't a crime. But when one of them decides on behalf of the other without asking, without informing, on the grounds that the other person was no longer capable, that was something else entirely. Among the 300 rare and notable volumes in the collection, there were books whose surrounding stories said more about me than any biography could. The first, as I have described, was the 1842 History of the American Revolution, bought at the Charles Street secondhand shop in 1972 for $4 in a week of instant noodles. I still remember the shop. A small dark storefront, the smell of dust and old paper, the owner sitting behind the counter reading the Boston Globe and not looking up when I came in. I stood at the used bookshelf for 30 minutes, picking up and putting down many volumes. And when I found that one, its deep blue leather cover faded, the gold lettering dim on the spine. I felt what book lovers describe but struggle to explain. The feeling that the book had been waiting for you there. And inside the front page, someone had written in ink that had turned brown with age, dated spring 1853. To my dear James, on the occasion of his departure for the West, may history guide your steps. Father. Someone had given this book to a person named James who was heading west in 1853. I never knew who James was or whether he ever came back, but the presence of that dedication, the brown ink, the slanted handwriting, a father's hand writing to his son before a long journey, made the book something more than a book. It was evidence that someone, 120 years before I picked it up, had believed that history was important enough to give to someone you loved before a long road ahead. Eleanor Helen Whitfield, née Morrison, died in April 2015 after 2 years fighting ovarian cancer. She died at 64, young enough that I've never grown accustomed to the absence, long enough that we had done together most of what we had wanted to do. In those last years when she knew her time was limited, Eleanor would often sit with me in the reading room in the afternoons. She couldn't read during those months because her eyes had grown weak, but she would sit there and we would talk about books, about history, about former students of both of ours, about the life we had lived and what was worth regretting and what wasn't. One afternoon, Eleanor said, "Tom, I need you to promise me something." "Tell me," I said. "Promise me you won't let that book collection leave this family in a way that you can't control. Those books are part of who you are. You've read them, you know each one. If the day comes when you want to let them go in the way you choose. Give them to a library, give them to students, whatever you want. But don't let someone else decide for you." I promised. And I kept that promise for 9 years after Eleanor died, until a stroke in January of 2024 put me in the hospital for 17 days and left Richard and Claudia alone at home with my reading room. I had broken my promise to Eleanor not because I chose to break it, but because I wasn't there to keep it. Now I needed to reclaim it. Late, but not too late, Saturday morning, February 8th. I woke before Richard and Claudia. This was unusual for me after the stroke. In the early days in the hospital, I had tended to wake late and lethargic. But last night I had slept like a man with no burdens. And this morning I woke with the clarity of someone who knew what needed to be done. I retrieved the book and envelope from under my pillow, sat up on the edge of the bed, opened the book and looked again at the yellowed envelope, the stock certificate, and my father's penciled slip. Standard Oil Company of New Jersey. 100 shares? 1954. I was a history professor, not a financial expert, but I knew enough to know the right questions to ask. Standard Oil of New Jersey had eventually become Esso, then Exxon, and after 1998 became ExxonMobil following the merger with Mobil. Across 70 years, that 100 original shares had split many times. I knew that much, but not the exact number of splits or their ratios. I needed two things: someone who knew about historical stock and an attorney. In that order. The person I thought of first was Martin Cho, a former student of mine who had graduated in 2002 and was now a financial advisor at State Street. We hadn't spoken in several years, but he sent Christmas cards every year and had been in touch when he heard I'd been hospitalized. I still had his number because I had called him about retirement planning in 2013. I called at 8 in the morning. Martin answered immediately. Professor Whitfield, I heard about the stroke. Are you all right? I kept meaning to call but didn't want to intrude. I need help, I said directly. I have a Standard Oil of New Jersey stock certificate from 1954. 100 shares. Can you tell me what that means today? There was a brief pause on the line. Then Martin said, his voice shifting in the way the voice of a financial person shifts when they're rapidly calculating something. Professor, can you say that again? Standard Oil stock, 54, 100 shares? That's right. Can you photograph it and email it to me right now? I need to see the serial number and the condition of the certificate. I asked Richard to help me take the photograph, without telling him what it was specifically, only that it was a historical document that needs checking. Richard didn't ask many questions because he was busy on his own phone. Martin called back 30 minutes later. Professor. His voice was calm, but beneath the calm I heard something important. I need to see the original certificate to confirm, but if this document is genuine and still valid, this is a significant situation. Significant how? Standard Oil of New Jersey split its shares multiple times from 1954 until it became ExxonMobil, Martin explained, his voice quick and clear in the way of someone explaining what they know well. If you calculate all the splits and reinvested dividends from that point to now, 100 original shares could have become several thousand shares of ExxonMobil. And ExxonMobil stock today? He paused. I heard keyboard clicks. Around $110 a share yesterday. I did the rough arithmetic in my head. But I need to emphasize that I need to see the original certificate, Martin continued. There are many things to verify. Whether the certificate is still valid, whether the dividends were ever received over 70 years, the transfer procedure. You'll need to see a lawyer and possibly an expert in historical securities. Can you come to Boston today? Yes, this afternoon. And Professor, don't tell anyone about this before we meet. There is one detail about the Federalist Papers volume and my father that I need to add here, because it matters not for its financial value, but for what it says about the man. When I came home in 1978 after my father's funeral, I brought back a small box of books from his Roxbury apartment. The books he had accumulated across his whole life. Not many, about 50 volumes, mostly history and biography, the kind a man who hadn't finished high school but read his whole life tends to choose. I put that box of books in my Cambridge apartment at the time and gradually absorbed those volumes into my own collection. The Federalist Papers in that box was not expensive or particularly rare by market standards. It was a 1950s reprint, green hardcover, the kind you could buy in any regular bookshop. My father was not a collector. He was simply a reader. What was particular was that he had read this book enough times to think of it as a safe place to keep something important. Or perhaps he chose it at random. I never knew. But here's what I think about most. My father kept that book from around 1954, when my grandfather gave him the stock certificate, until he died in 1978. 24 years. In those 24 years, he didn't sell the stock, didn't tell anyone about it, and left behind a short penciled note in a small envelope with the instruction that it was mine if I found it. I think my father had wanted to tell me about the stock many times, but never found the right moment. Or perhaps he thought there was still plenty of time. I was 29 when he died, absorbed in my dissertation and my new marriage and a life opening up ahead. He may have thought he didn't want to burden me, or that there would be a better time. That better time never came. And instead, he left the penciled note and trusted that the book would last, and I would find it. 46 years after he wrote that note, I sat on the floor of a reading room at midnight and read it. And what I felt was not joy at the money, though the money was real and mattered. What I felt was sudden and unexpected closeness to a father who had died when I was not yet old enough to fully understand who he was. "Dad, I found it," I said quietly to the dark. "To whom?" "I don't know. Just saying it out loud because sometimes you need to say something even when there is no one there to hear." Catherine Osei was the attorney I met through Martin's recommendation. A 50-year-old Ghanaian-American woman who specialized in estates and property law with an office on Tremont Street. Martin called her from my house on Saturday morning after confirming the certificate's condition, and she agreed to meet me Monday. Monday, February 10th. Martin drove me to Catherine's office on Tremont Street. I sat in the office with its glass wall looking out on the Boston February sky, gray and cold and characteristic in the way I found beautiful, though others often complained, and listened to Catherine explain what I needed to know. "This stock certificate," Catherine said, holding the original in white cotton gloves the way you handle historical documents, "may still be legally valid. Old stock certificates from major companies like Standard Oil don't automatically become void. They need to be activated through a verification and conversion process." She placed the document down and looked at me. "However, there are several things you need to understand clearly about ownership and the current situation." "I'm listening," I said. "This certificate is in the name of Harold Whitfield, your father. For you to exercise shareholder rights, you need to demonstrate that you are the lawful heir of Harold Whitfield and that this asset was not distributed in his estate." "My father died in 1978, I said. "His will left the house and modest savings to me and my mother. But the book, and the stock inside it, wasn't mentioned because nobody knew it was there." "That's a complication, but not an insurmountable one," Catherine said. "We can argue this is an omitted asset from the estate, an asset that existed but wasn't located at the time of distribution. And since you are the sole surviving heir, you have the standing to make a claim." "And the books?" I asked. Catherine nodded. "That's the second and more immediately pressing issue. You are the legal owner of that book collection. It is not joint property with your children, and you have never gifted or transferred it to them. Sending the books to an auction house without your consent is a violation of your property rights." She looked at me. "Do you want to stop the auction?" "I want to control what happens to my books," I said. "Yeah, not necessarily stop it entirely, but the decision must be mine, not anyone else's." Catherine nodded and began writing. Wednesday, February 12th. Catherine contacted Pemberton's auction house, not to suspend the auction immediately, but to notify them that the legal owner of the collection was in the process of review and was requesting a hold on all transactions pending formal notification. Pemberton's, following the advice of their own legal department, agreed to pause as soon as they received the written notice. The same day, Catherine also sent a formal request to ExxonMobil Corporation to begin the process of verifying the historical stock certificate. This process could take weeks to months. Old stock certificates require authentication, historical shareholder records need to be traced, and the legal inheritance questions need resolution. But that same day, Martin, clad with his financial industry experience and contacts among experts in historical securities, had obtained a preliminary estimate from a consultant in New York. Martin called me at 4 in the afternoon. "Professor, I have a rough preliminary figure. Not precise. Formal verification is needed, but enough to give you a picture." "Tell me," I said. 100 Standard Oil shares from 1954, calculated through all the splits and adjustments until they became ExxonMobil, is estimated at approximately 6,700 to 7,200 current ExxonMobil shares. He paused. At today's price, that's around $740,000 to $790,000. Close to $800,000. I sat in the reading room and heard that number. But, Martin continued, yeah, that's if the dividends were never received over the past 70 years, which could increase or decrease the figure depending on how it's handled legally, and not counting taxes and fees. I don't want you building hopes on an unconfirmed number. I understand, I said. Thank you, Martin. Professor, if I may ask, are you all right? I thought about the question. I'm better than I was last Friday, I said honestly. Thank you for asking. Friday, February 14th. Valentine's Day, which Eleanor and I had marked for 40 years by reading side by side in the comfortable silence of two people who didn't need to say much to understand each other. I called a family meeting. Not just Richard and Claudia. I also invited Catherine Ossie and Martin Cho. And I invited Christine, my daughter who lived in Providence, to come to Boston the evening before. Christine and I had not been as close as I would have liked in recent years, partly because of geography and partly because I wasn't good at maintaining contact without Eleanor as the bridge. But when I called and gave her a brief account of what had happened, she said, "Dad, I'm on my way." We gathered in the living room of the Commonwealth Avenue house. Richard and Claudia sat on the long sofa. Christine sat beside me. She placed her hand over mine when I sat down, a small gesture that warmed me more than many larger things during that week. Catherine sat in the armchair across from Richard and Claudia. Martin stood near the door. I'd like to begin with some legal facts, Catherine said, with the professional, even voice of someone who had sat in many rooms like this and knew how to guide the proceedings. The book collection owned by Professor Thomas Whitfield was taken to Pemberton's auction house without his consent. This is a violation of his property rights. We have requested the auction be suspended, and Pemberton's has agreed. Richard looked at me. Dad, we only wanted what was best for you. You just had a stroke. You need to focus on recovering, not on... Richard. I interrupted him, not in anger, but with the voice I had used for 38 years of teaching when I wanted students to stop and listen. I've heard what you and Claudia want to say. Now you listen to me. He stopped. I survived a stroke, I said. My mind is still working. My memory is still good. I can read and understand what I read. The fact that I need a cane to walk does not affect my cognitive capacity. And my cognitive capacity is what determines whether I have the right to make decisions about my own property. I looked at Claudia. That book collection is not old paper. It is the work of a lifetime, and it does not belong to anyone's boat. Claudia opened her mouth, closed it again. There is one additional matter, Catherine said, placing a file folder on the coffee table. Yeah, we have discovered within that book collection a stock certificate of significant value. This certificate belongs to Professor Thomas Whitfield as the lawful heir. She placed a copy of the certificate on the table. The original was in her office, safe. This is one of the reasons why Professor Thomas's control over his own assets needs to be established clearly and immediately. Richard looked at the paper, looked at me, looked back at the paper. Stock? Standard Oil? From 1954, I confirmed. Your grandfather left it to my father, and my father left it to me. Tucked inside a book, the book you were about to sell. The room was quiet. How much? Claudia asked, her first question since the meeting began, and a question that said more about her than anything else could have. Not yet precisely confirmed, Catherine said. But the preliminary expert estimate is in the range of $700,000 to $800,000, depending on the legal verification process. Richard didn't sit down. He nearly sank into the sofa. Dad, did you know that stock was in the book before now? No, I said honestly. I had completely forgotten about it. My father never got to tell me before he died. I only found it after coming home from the hospital and sitting in the reading room. And if that book collection had been sold at auction? Then whoever bought the old Federalist Papers volume would have found the envelope, I said. And that stock would no longer belong to this family. That meeting did not end in complete reconciliation. The things that had been said couldn't be taken back. Old paper. You can just watch television. The decision made on my behalf without asking. Those things sat in that living room with everyone who sat in it and did not disappear, simply because people wished they would. Richard said, "Dad, we were wrong. I know that." I looked at my son, the 46-year-old man sitting on the sofa with the expression of someone absorbing the consequences of a bad decision. And I asked the question I genuinely wanted answered. Did you think I was no longer mentally capable? Or did you think this was an opportunity? Richard didn't answer immediately. I let him sit with the question for a moment. "Both," he said finally, his voice low. I thought you were weaker and needed decisions made for you. And I also wanted money to pay for the boat. Both were wrong. I'm sorry." I looked at him a moment longer. Then I nodded. Not to say I forgave him or didn't forgive him, but to acknowledge that the honest answer mattered more than a polished one. "Catherine," I said, "we continue." During March, Catherine handled most of the legal procedures. The book collection was returned from Pemberton's. Every volume that had been taken there, not a single one missing, under the terms of the legal notice Catherine had sent along with a guarantee of reimbursement for transport costs. Richard and Claudia agreed to leave the Commonwealth Avenue house by the end of March. Not because I asked them to leave, I didn't. And that mattered to me because I was still Richard's father, and that hadn't changed. But Catherine had advised that to prevent similar situations in the future, a clear separation of living space and decision-making authority was necessary. Richard agreed. He and Claudia rented an apartment in Back Bay. The stock verification process took 2 more months and involved more legal procedure than I had expected. But at the end of April, Catherine received official confirmation. The stock certificate was genuine, my inheritance rights were established, and the converted value, after deducting taxes and applicable fees, was approximately $620,000. $620,000. From a small, pale yellow envelope tucked between pages 6 and 7 of a book my father had left me in the way fathers and sons often leave things for each other. Not in words, but in the things that remain after the person has gone. The second book I remember is the 3-volume set of David Hume's philosophy, printed in Edinburgh in 1782. I bought it at a small Providence auction in 1989. When I had been a professor for 13 years and for the first time in my life, I had enough money to buy something genuinely expensive without thinking hard about it. The bid was $210. Significant at the time, but not impossible. Inside the cover of the first volume was the signature of the first owner, J. Hartley, Boston, 1791. Someone in Boston in 1791 had read David Hume, the Scottish philosopher born in 1711 who died in 1776. 200 years later, I sat in the reading room on Commonwealth Avenue and read the same pages. The third is the first printing of The Souls of Black Folk, W.E.B. Du Bois, 1903. I found it in a 1995 trip to Atlanta at a used bookshop in Decatur operated by an 82-year-old man named Mr. Cornelius Jordan. The book had no cover. The original had been lost, perhaps decades before, but the pages were intact, and Mr. Jordan priced it at $120 on the basis that books without covers are cheaper, but they're still books. When I paid, he looked at me and asked, "You know what this is?" I said I did. He nodded and said, "Then take good care of it." I had taken good care of it for nearly 30 years. Every book in that collection had a story like those. Not a story about price or market value, but a story about who had held it before me, why, and what had brought it to my hands. That is what Claudia called old paper that causes allergies and could not see and did not wish to see. And it is also what no auction catalog can price correctly. At the end of April, the day Catherine called with the confirmed figure, $620,000 after taxes and fees, I was sitting in the reorganized reading room. The books had come back. Not in exactly their original places because some shelves had been dismantled, while Pemberton's was taking inventory and the room still held a faint smell of fresh paint from when someone had painted the walls without asking me. But the books were here, stacked in cardboard boxes along the walls, waiting to be arranged. Congratulations, Catherine said over the phone. Thank you, I said. Catherine, I'd like to tell you now what I intend to do with that money. I'm listening. I want to set aside a portion for Christine. 150,000. And I want to reserve a portion for my own living expenses. I'm 75 and I have medical costs. And I want to use the remaining portion to establish a scholarship fund at Boston University. I looked at the boxes of books around me. A scholarship for history students from families without financial means. The fund will be named for Harold and Eleanor Whitfield, my father and my wife. There was a small silence on the line. Then Catherine said, "You want to give back what they gave you." My father took me to the public library every Saturday, I said. He had no money, but he had time, and he used that time to show me that knowledge doesn't belong to any single person. Eleanor taught literature at Roxbury High School for 30 years and was never materially wealthy, but was rich in a different way. This money, which began from an envelope tucked in my father's book, should go in a direction that both of them would approve of. Catherine was quiet for another moment. Then, "I'll prepare the legal documents. You'll need to meet with me next week." Next week, I agreed. I hung up and sat in the reading room with the unsorted boxes of books around me. The April Boston afternoon sent sunlight through the window, the pale, clear light of early spring, the kind that after a long winter makes you remember that this city has colors other than gray and white. I stood up slowly and began taking books out of the boxes to put them back in order. Not because I was in any hurry, I wasn't, but because I wanted to use my own hands, still not entirely steady after the stroke, to place each book back in its rightful place. That was how I reclaimed my room. In the weeks after the February 14th family meeting, the house on Commonwealth Avenue carried an atmosphere I can only describe as honest in an uncomfortable way. Richard and Claudia were still there while searching for a new apartment, a process that took more than 3 weeks. Those 3 weeks were spent living under the same roof after all of those things had been said aloud, and no one knew quite how to behave with each other in those circumstances. Claudia said nothing more negative to me after the meeting, not because she had suddenly changed, but because Catherine had sent her a letter summarizing which behaviors could constitute legal violations, and she was pragmatic enough to understand this was not the time to say more. But that silence was not a comfortable silence. It was the silence of someone holding back for practical reasons, not because anything had genuinely changed. I managed this in the way a 75-year-old man recovering from a stroke with an unsteady left leg can. I went into the reading room in the mornings, did physical therapy every day, read books in the afternoons, and slept at night. Not because I had no emotions about what had happened. I did, and they were not simple. But because at 75, after 40 years of teaching history, I had learned that some things need time to settle, and there's no benefit in forcing them faster than their natural speed. Christine called every evening during that period, not asking much, only asking if I was all right and telling me about her work in Providence. And those calls were not long, 15 to 20 minutes. But they were consistent, and that consistency mattered in a way I hadn't known I had been missing until I had it again. One evening, about a week before Richard and Claudia moved out, Richard knocked on my reading room door. The first time in many months that he knocked instead of walking straight in. I said, "Come in," and he opened the door but stood in the doorway, not entering. "Dad, do you need help reorganizing the books?" I looked at him, looked at the shelves around me, still with many gaps and many books still in boxes. Then I said, "Sit down." He sat in the chair near the door. Not my leather armchair, but the small wooden chair that Eleanor used to sit in when she came into the reading room with me. "Yeah, do you know what this book is?" I took a book from the nearest cardboard box and handed it to him. The 1842 History of the American Revolution. The first one, The Instant Noodle Week. Richard held the book, looked at the cover, opened it. looked at the handwritten inscription in brown ink, dated 1853. To my dear James. He read it aloud, then looked up at me. 1853? 1853, I said. Someone gave it to his son before the sun went west. I don't know who they were. Neither do you. But I've held this book for 55 years and thought about them many times. Richard looked at the book in his hand, then at me. When did you buy this? When I was 23, I ate instant noodles for a week to save up the $4. He was quiet for a moment. Dad, you don't owe me an apology for that. I'm not apologizing, I said. I just want you to know that these books are not just paper. Each one is something I chose, with its own story, with its own meaning to me. When you said old paper, or when Claudia did, I understood you didn't know. Not because you were stupid or bad, but because I had never explained it well enough. Richard sat with the book in his hands for a moment. Then he set it down carefully on the table. Not carelessly, but in the way you set down something that deserves attention. Can I help you put the shelves back? He asked again. Yes, I said. And we sat in the reading room for 2 hours that evening, me talking about each book as I took it from a box, and Richard arranging them on the shelves as I directed. Not a deep and complete reconciliation, but something real. A father and son in a room full of books, working together in silence that was easier than the silence of the weeks before. But not all the books would stay on the custom oak shelves of Commonwealth Avenue. I had been thinking about this through March and April, in the morning sitting with a cup of coffee looking out the window and thinking without urgency. I was 75. My left leg was still not entirely steady after the stroke. My eyes could still read, but not as quickly as before. And this house, 3 floors, 7 rooms on Commonwealth Avenue, was a house too large for one person living alone with a room full of books that he was reading more slowly than before. I had thought often about what Eleanor had said in her final months. When the day comes that you want to let them go in the way you choose. I chose. Late May, I contacted the Boston Public Library, not through a representative or intermediary, but directly by telephone, asking to speak with the Director of Special Collections. The woman I spoke with was Dr. Amara Williams, 48 years old, who had worked with rare collections in Boston for 30 years. When I introduced myself and described the collection, she was quiet a moment and then asked, Professor Whitfield? Thomas Whitfield from Boston University? Yes, I said. I read your history of slavery in Massachusetts in 1997 when I was a student. That was the book that first made me think seriously about archival and preservation work. I didn't know what to say for a few seconds. Then I said, I want to donate part of my collection to the library, the rarest and most suitable portions for your mission. Not all of it. I still want to keep some to read until I can't read anymore. But most of it should be in an environment where it's properly preserved and widely accessible. We would be deeply honored, Dr. Williams said. Could you come and meet us next week? Tuesday, I said. That Tuesday meeting was the best meeting I had in many months, not because anything dramatic occurred, but because of the opposite. It was ordinary in the best possible way. 2 people working in related fields, sitting and talking about books, about history, about what it means to preserve knowledge across generations. Dr. Williams led me through the library's basement archives. Temperature and humidity-controlled rooms, metal cabinets holding documents in acid-free protective sleeves, 17th and 18th century books placed on support pillows at proper resting angles. Every book here, Doctor, Paul Williams said as we stood in the archive, is a connection to the person who wrote it, to the person who printed it, to everyone who read it before us. That is what my father taught me, I said, although he didn't put it in those words. 273 volumes from my collection were transferred to the Boston Public Library at the end of May. Not all of it. I kept about 200 volumes, the ones bound most closely to personal memory or the ones I was still reading and rereading. But 273 went to a place where they would be properly preserved, widely accessible, and would continue to do the work that books have always done best. Connect people to ideas that are larger than any individual. At the small ceremony for the handover, just me, Dr. Williams, two library staff members, and Christine, who had come from Providence, I held the first old book I had ever bought in 1972, the 1842 history of the American Revolution, the one that had cost a week of instant noodles, and handed it to Dr. Williams. "This one is special," I said. This was the first. Dr. Williams received the book with both hands. "We will keep it safe." "I know," I said. "I want to say more about Martin Cho, because his story says something important about the kind of connection that education creates." Martin took my course in 1999 in his second year at Boston University. He was 21 at the time, the son of Korean immigrants, working 3 part-time jobs to pay tuition. In my course on American economic history, an elective that students typically chose because it had a reputation for being manageable, Martin was the student who asked the most and the best questions. I remember one class when we were discussing the Great Depression and its effects on working-class families. Martin raised his hand and asked, "Professor, if someone in that period held Standard Oil stock while everyone else was selling, what would that person have today?" That question wasn't in the course syllabus, but it was a good question, and we spent 20 minutes on it. On the durability of oil and gas through American economic history, on the people who held instead of sold and what came of that. I didn't remember that discussion when I called Martin in February. I remembered it afterward when Martin was sitting in my reading room and said, "Professor, do you know what the first question I asked when I got the photo of the certificate was? Whether your grandfather had held through the Great Depression." And the answer is yes. My grandfather had received the stock in 1954, but the Whitfield family came from Virginia, and my great-grandfather may well have held Standard Oil stock from before 1929 through the Depression and continued holding. That was something Martin couldn't confirm from the single certificate I had, but it was something he raised as a possibility. "The ones who didn't sell are the ones who were rewarded later," Martin said, almost echoing what he had asked in my class more than 20 years before. I looked at him and smiled, the first genuine smile in many weeks. "Do you remember asking that question in my class?" Martin looked surprised for a second, then laughed. "You remembered too?" I just now did. We sat in my reading room that February Saturday afternoon and talked. Not about stocks, but about history, about what economic history teaches and what financial markets learn from history. Martin was a finance person, but also someone who thought about larger questions beyond the numbers. And that wasn't accidental. He had studied economic history with a professor who thought about economic history as something connected to human beings. There are connections that teachers and students create not through specific knowledge, but through ways of thinking, how to ask questions, how to see a problem from many sides, how to refuse the easy answer. Those connections don't end when the class ends, and sometimes they reappear at exactly the right moment in ways nobody planned. I need to say more about Richard and Christine, not because the story needs more commentary, but because the truth is always more complicated than the simple framework people use to tell a story. Christine, my daughter, 43, living in Providence and working as a program coordinator for a nonprofit education organization, was not perfect. We had not been close in recent years, partly because of distance, partly because I wasn't good at maintaining contact, and partly because small disagreements that accumulate over time, people tend to call life when they don't want to call it fault on both sides. When Christine came to Boston that Friday, February 14th, and sat beside me at the family meeting with her hand on mine in a small but sufficient gesture, that didn't mean all those years of distance vanished. It meant that at an important moment she made the right choice. And that was the starting point for something more real than the artificial, everything is fine, that families tend to maintain. We began meeting more regularly, not in the idealized movie family way, but in the practical way of two adults relearning how to talk to each other. Sometimes in Boston, sometimes I drove to Providence when my leg was strong enough, sometimes just evening phone calls, we talked about books. Christine had inherited the love of reading from Eleanor and me, though she had never gone into academia. We talked about Eleanor, and sometimes we were simply quiet on the phone for a few seconds, and that too was enough. Richard was different and more complicated. After he and Claudia moved out at the end of March, we didn't speak for nearly 6 weeks. Not because I had cut off contact, but because neither of us knew where to begin. Some things had been said and couldn't be taken back. Some things hadn't been said and needed to be, but the time hadn't come. Late May, Richard called me one evening. His voice, Moinen, and the voice of a 46-year-old man, my son, sounded tired in the way that isn't about missing sleep, but about carrying something heavy. "Dad," he began, then stopped, then continued. "I want to apologize to you, not because you had the stock or because your attorney was stronger than mine, but because what I did was wrong. I thought you needed decisions made for you rather than making your own. And that was wrong regardless of whether you had the stock or not." I sat with the phone and that statement for a moment. "Thank you," I said. Or that wasn't a complete forgiveness in the sense of erasing everything. It was an acknowledgement that a genuine apology had value and I had heard it. Would you like to see me?" "Yes, next week, just the two of us." That meeting, Richard and me in a small coffee shop on Charles Street, no Claudia, no Catherine, no one else, was hard in the truest sense of the word. No theatrics or big emotions. Just two people sitting across from each other trying to talk honestly while between them were things that had been said and done that couldn't be retrieved. I didn't say everything was fine. Everything was not fine. But what I said to him was what I genuinely believed. "Richard, I don't know where I went wrong in raising you. Maybe I worked too much when you were small. Maybe I didn't say enough about what actually mattered. Why not? But you're 46 years old and your decisions are yours. I can't make them for you." "Dad," Richard said, "Claudia and I separated." I sat with that information. "When?" "Last month. Not because of what happened with you, or not only because of that. A lot of things had been wrong for a long time. What happened with you was when everything came to the surface." I said nothing. Didn't say you deserved it, and didn't say I understand. Neither was right in the way that truth is never right on time or convenient. I drank my coffee. Richard drank his coffee. We sat in the small shop on Charles Street on a June Boston afternoon, while people walking the sidewalk outside were wearing light jackets and looking at the sky with the watchful expression of people who know that Boston sunshine can change in an hour. "Dad," Richard said finally, "can you tell me about grandfather? Really, not just the stories you usually tell. I want to know what grandfather was actually like." I looked at my son and recognized this was the first time in many years he had asked me that question. Not a question about money, not about the house, not about any of the things people ask when they're calculating. A question about a person. "Harold Whitfield," I began, "was the man who took me to the public library every Saturday." And I talked. For an hour, I told Richard about my father, about those Saturday mornings at the Boston Public Library, about the Chestnut Hill streetcar, about the things he used to say that I had carried my whole life. And Richard sat and listened, without interrupting, without looking at his phone. That was not a complete reconciliation. But it was the start of something that could become real, if both of us had the patience for it. In the autumn of 2024, I sold the house on Commonwealth Avenue. Not because I was forced to, not because I needed the money, but because after months of living alone in 7 rooms with 200 books, and only the sound of my own footsteps on the old hardwood, I recognized that too much space is not always freedom. Sometimes it is only emptiness at large scale. I bought a small apartment near Harvard Square. 2 bedrooms, a living room, a kitchen, and a study with room enough for small bookshelves. 3rd floor looking out on an interior courtyard with an old pine tree. Close enough to Widener Library at Harvard to walk there on the mornings when my leg was strong enough. While moving, I found in the drawer of the old desk a photograph I hadn't known was still there. A picture of my father and me in front of the Boston Public Library, and taken when I was about 10 years old. He was wearing a winter coat. I was wearing a wool hat pulled down over my ears. We were standing before the great stone columns of the Copley Square building, with the expression of people who had just come out of the place they loved best in the world. I placed the photograph on the desk in the new apartment, beside the cup of pencils and a pad of white paper. I was working on a new book, my first since retiring, about the history of public libraries in America and their role in democratizing knowledge. Not dry academic work, but a story of places and people, of children like me who used to come to the library because the books were free there, and the librarians didn't look at them in the way that outsiders sometimes looked. Now, Martin Cho visited one October afternoon and sat in the new study. Smaller than the old reading room, but warm in the way that just enough space tends to be warmer than too much space. He looked around the bookshelves, looked at the photograph on the desk, then at me. "You look better than you did in February," he said. "I do physical therapy 3 times a week," I said. "The left leg is better. Not quite what it was, but enough to walk to the library." "And you're writing a book." "Writing," I confirmed. "Slowly, but writing." Martin looked at the photograph on the desk. "Is that your father and you in front of the library?" "My father," I said. "Harold Whitfield, the man who took me to the public library every Saturday and taught me that knowledge was something no one could steal." "He was right," Martin said. "He was generally right about the important things," I said. I write these words in the winter of 2025, sitting in the study of the apartment near Harvard Square, looking at the old pine tree in the courtyard through the window. Light snow has settled on the branches. A small squirrel is moving between the boughs with the complete ease of a creature entirely at home in its environment. I am 76 now. A year has passed since the stroke, and the Friday, February 7th return home. My left leg is still not entirely as it was. Perhaps it never will be. But I can walk, I can read, I can write, and every week I go to Widener Library to sit in the presence of old books and do the work I have done my whole life, thinking about history and what it means. There are things I want to say, not as lessons or a list to memorize, but as the words of a man who has lived 76 years and is looking back from enough distance to see more clearly. The first is about what people call wealth. The large house, the boat, the money in the account, those things are real and have real value. I don't deny that. But 76 years have taught me that people often confuse wealth in the accumulative sense with wealth in the sense of something that can sustain you when everything else goes wrong. My father was not rich in money, but he was rich in the second sense, and that wealth he passed to me in a way completely different from a financial inheritance. The second is about age and cognitive capacity. As people grow older, those around them have a tendency, not always from bad motives, to look at the surface signs of slowing down and wrongly conclude that the person can no longer make their own decisions. A cane, a rougher voice after a stroke, a morning of sleeping in, these are not evidence of cognitive decline. And even where some cognitive decline exists at some level, that does not automatically confer on others the right to decide for that person. Older people have the right to make mistakes. Older people have the right to make decisions that others disagree with. That right does not vanish along with walking speed or the ability to recall names. The third is what I believe my father understood but didn't articulate. Or perhaps he did, and it took me many years to truly hear it. Knowledge is not merely information. Knowledge is what changes how you see the world, changes the questions you ask, changes what you find important. And once you have that knowledge, a genuine knowledge, not memorized facts for examinations, no one can take it from you. Memory may weaken, the body may decline, but what books have built in you across many years? The way of thinking, the habit of questioning, the capacity to look at a problem from many sides, that persists in a different way. Deeper, more durable. That is what I want to say to whoever reads this story. Not as a moral lesson, but as the true account of a person who learned it in the most stubborn possible way. Through experience, through loss, through sitting alone in a reading room at midnight with a cane and a yellowed envelope found in a cardboard box.